A confident black woman boards a first-class flight, expecting the comfort and respect her ticket promises. But from the moment she steps on a plane, she becomes the target of cruel, calculated exclusion and humiliation that seems designed to erase her presence entirely. As subtle slights build into overt acts of discrimination, she faces a battle not just for dignity, but for justice high above the clouds, until a surprising turn reveals a truth that changes everything in an instant. This is a story about power, prejudice, and the fight to be seen when the world tries to look away. If you want to follow this gripping journey of resilience and revelation, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Where are you watching from? And what part of the story moves you most? Your voice matters. Thalissa Rose stepped through the aircraft door with quiet grace, heels tapping softly against the rubber floor panels as she crossed the threshold into first class. It was early, barely 7 a.m., but the cabin was already half full, humming with the soft rustle of luxury magazines, the clink of porcelain coffee cups, and the practiced silence of seasoned travelers who were used to getting what they paid for. She didn't glance around. She never did. Not when she knew she was the only one like her in this section. Always the only one. She walked down the short aisle with her carry-on held firmly in her left hand, the rich leather handle imprinted faintly into her palm from a decade of business travel. Her navy blue blazer was pressed to perfection, her posture straight, movements efficient. She had spent years mastering this exact rhythm. Enter quickly, make no unnecessary eye contact, store your belongings, sit down. The less space you occupied, the less pushback you received. Seat 2A, window, preferred. She stopped, lifted her bag fluidly into the overhead bin, and reached to hang her neatly folded coat along the side rod when a blur of motion passed just inches from her shoulder. A flight attendant, young blonde, lips pinched tight into a line of disapproval, swung a cleaning cloth toward the overhead bins of row 1. The gesture looked routine, almost robotic, except for the way her wrist twisted slightly, flicking a stream of cool water directly onto Thalissa's shoulder and arm. In one smooth, almost calculated movement, droplets splashed down across the soft fabric of her blazer, soaking through the sleeve and the crisp white silk shirt beneath. There was no gasp of realization, no murmured sorry, not even a flicker of acknowledgement. The attendant turned and walked away without pause, leaving the wet stain to bloom quietly across the expensive fabric. Thalissa stood there for a moment, blinking once, lips pressed together as she lowered her arms. She gently pulled the coat down from the hanger and inspected the damage, not catastrophic, but visible. Her hands were steady, her breath controlled. She turned and slid the coat into the overhead compartment beside her carry-on, then sat down slowly, brushing a damp strand of hair away from her forehead as if nothing had happened. But it had. Around her, no one said anything. A man across the aisle had glanced up when the water fell, but quickly returned to his newspaper. A woman a row back shifted uncomfortably and looked away. Thalissa knew this routine too well. The absence of words was not silence. It was complicity. She leaned back into the plush leather seat and looked straight ahead. She could already feel the prickle of humiliation spreading through her chest, not for the water, not for the stain, but for the familiar stinging reminder that even here, in this space she had earned, she could be made small. She reached down to pull out her tablet from her bag, trying to lose herself in work. The screen glowed to life, displaying the last draft of a proposal she had spent 2 months crafting, and yet the words swam in front of her, incoherent. Her mind wouldn't cooperate. Her fingers tapped the edge of the case absently, and after a few moments she shut it off and placed it on the tray table. Across the aisle, the same attendant returned, offering a fresh stack of newspapers and premium hot towels. She handed them graciously to a middle-aged man in a tailored gray suit. She paused to chat, asking if he wanted cream or sugar with his coffee. When she turned to continue down the row, her eyes passed over Thalissa without stopping. No towel, no coffee, no glance. Thalissa watched her go, the sound of clinking china following her like an insult. A tightness formed in Thalissa's jaw, but she refused to adjust her posture or shift uncomfortably. She stayed exactly as she was because fidgeting meant acknowledging something was wrong, and she had trained herself not to give them that satisfaction. A few minutes later, the attendant passed once more. This time, Thalissa lifted a hand slowly to stop her. "Excuse me," she said in an even, measured tone. The woman stopped, barely turning her head. "I believe some water was spilled on me earlier while you were wiping the bin," Thalissa said, gesturing lightly toward her still damp sleeve. The attendant's eyes flicked downward, then back up. Her lips parted slightly, but instead of apology, she replied with a disinterested shrug and said, "It happens," before continuing down the aisle without pause. "It happens." Thalissa sat back slowly, the words burrowing into her spine like cold steel. The flight hadn't even left the gate, and already the hierarchy of the cabin had been made clear. She stared at the back of the seat in front of her, trying to focus on the stitched emblem of the airline brand, her chest tightening beneath the layers of expensive fabric. She thought about the countless times she had endured moments like this, on flights, in lobbies, in boardrooms, each one a grain of salt slowly dissolving in the wound. Her colleagues would tell her not to take it personally. "Ignore it," they'd say. "It's just a bad day, a cranky staffer, nothing to do with you." But it was always to do with her. Always. The pilot made an announcement overhead, his voice calm and sterile. She unclasped her arms and rested her hands on her lap, fingers curling slightly inward. Her mouth was dry, but she didn't ask for water. She had learned that sometimes asking was interpreted as demanding, and demanding came with consequences. So she waited. The plane ascended through low clouds, a soft tremor rippling through the cabin, and the seatbelt sign dimmed overhead. One by one, passengers began to relax, reclining, removing shoes, flipping open tablets, or ordering wine with the entitlement of those who didn't have to think twice. The attendants moved through the aisles with polished trays and practiced smiles, lifting lids from dishes with dramatic flair, the scent of seared steak and truffle risotto wafting gently across the cabin. Silverware clinked, glasses touched, compliments were exchanged. Every row in the first-class section received their meal within minutes, every row except hers. She watched as the cart rolled past her seat, stopped at 3B, reversed to 1A, then returned to the galley. No eye contact, no explanation. Her stomach tightened, not from hunger, but from the growing heat of embarrassment crawling beneath her skin. The man seated beside her was already halfway through his entree. He hadn't acknowledged the discrepancy, hadn't seemed to notice. That was the worst part, how effortlessly people pretended not to see. 20 minutes passed before her tray arrived. A different attendant, younger, her expression hurried and stiff, placed it in front of Thalissa without a word. There was no linen, no appetizer, and when Thalissa removed the plastic lid, she discovered the dish was missing its main component. No protein, just a cold bed of overcooked vegetables and a dry piece of bread. She looked down at the tray for a long moment, then slowly placed the lid back on top. She didn't call anyone. She didn't press the button. She simply folded her napkin across her lap like she was preparing to eat, even though she knew she wouldn't. Her throat clenched, and she turned her face slightly toward the window to block the view of anyone passing. Minutes later, the same attendant who had ignored her earlier returned to offer dessert and drinks to the passengers nearby. She laughed as she leaned toward the man in 2B, asking whether he preferred Merlot or Chardonnay. And when he said neither, she joked about whiskey. He smiled. She touched his arm. Thalissa waited until the moment felt right, until the attendant turned ever so slightly toward her row and raised her hand calmly, intending to request water. Something simple, something neutral. The attendant's eyes met hers for a fraction of a second. No words passed between them, but her face remained frozen in a neutral expression, and without even pausing to acknowledge the raised hand, she pivoted and walked away. Thalissa's hand slowly lowered back to the armrest. Her palm was trembling, though she forced her fingers to still. She swallowed hard and closed her eyes for a moment, shutting out the clatter of glassware, the soft murmurs of casual conversation, and the constant sound of exclusion dressed in professionalism. She opened them again and saw another attendant pass by with a tray of coffee and cream. This one didn't even glance in her direction. The isolation was no longer subtle. It was surgical. She was being erased in plain sight. The ache in her chest spread, pulsing behind her ribs, radiating into her shoulders. This wasn't about a missed meal or forgotten drink. It was about control, about being reminded that even when she bought the same ticket, wore the same clothes, and walked the same jet bridge as everyone else, she would always be treated like an intruder. Her fingers curled into fists in her lap, but her face didn't move. She had become an expert at appearing unbothered. That, too, was a defense mechanism. The man beside her asked for a refill and received it instantly. Another passenger called for a blanket and was given two. Her arms remained folded across her lap, her fingers stiff from being curled too long. She was not just excluded, she was being conditioned to accept that exclusion as normal, her discomfort treated like white noise in a space reserved for the quietly powerful. But it wasn't over. The plane began its taxi toward the runway, the mechanical groan of shifting flaps, and the low rumble of the engines pulsing under the cabin floor. Flight attendants made final checks, walking in tandem through the first-class section with crisp efficiency. One of them, the same woman who had ignored Thalyssa's raised hand earlier, moved methodically down the aisle, stopping at each passenger to check belts and trays, her tone light and professional. When she reached Thalyssa's row, she paused, looked down without a word, and reached forward with both hands. Thalissa glanced up, startled by the sudden proximity. The attendant bent over as if inspecting the seatbelt, but instead of simply checking, she grabbed both ends of the strap and yanked hard. The belt cinched tight across Thalyssa's waist, pulling her forward with a jolt. Her back arched involuntarily, her breath catching in her throat. She gasped softly, trying to suppress the sound, but the sharp motion had forced the air from her lungs. It was aggressive, intentional. The attendant stepped back without a word, her face blank, and continued to the next row as if nothing had happened. No apology, no explanation. Thalissa slowly leaned back into her seat, breath shallow, her eyes wide. The man next to her looked up briefly, but said nothing. His gaze returned to his tablet, as if her physical reaction had been part of a turbulence warning instead of a calculated act of control. No one intervened. No one asked if she was okay. Around her, passengers adjusted pillows, requested mimosas, flipped through the in-flight magazine. Thalissa sat frozen, her chest constricted, the belt pressing so tightly across her midsection it felt like a restraint rather than a safety measure. Her body was no longer hers. It was something to be manipulated, policed, adjusted to the comfort of others. The speaker overhead crackled. The captain's voice, cool and rehearsed, welcomed passengers aboard, noted favorable weather conditions, and promised a smooth ride into San Francisco. Then silence. Moments later, the cockpit door opened, and a tall man in a double-breasted pilot uniform emerged, adjusting the gold-trimmed cuffs on his sleeves. The pilot, presumably Captain Wexler, based on the name tag that glinted briefly under the LED cabin lights, began walking down the aisle of first class, stopping at each row to greet passengers personally. He smiled warmly, shook hands, asked about business trips and family vacations with the practiced familiarity of someone used to charming the elite. He bent low to speak to an older couple in 1A and 1B, grinned at a tech executive in 2B, leaned in to compliment a woman's designer coat in 3A. When he reached Thalyssa's row, he didn't slow down. His eyes never met hers. He moved past her seat without hesitation, not even sparing a glance, as if she occupied space without existing. He continued on, chatting with the next row, asking someone about Napa Valley, laughing at a reference to private vineyards. Thalissa stared straight ahead, her spine rigid, heart racing, not from admiration or excitement, but from the deep, raw sting of being publicly disregarded. There was no ambiguity. She hadn't simply been skipped. She had been made invisible. The pilot returned down the opposite aisle, stopping to shake a few more hands, then disappeared back into the cockpit. His absence left behind a trail of small pleasantries and a heavier silence in the space where she sat. The man next to her turned slightly and made a half-hearted attempt at conversation. "He's a good captain," he said, gesturing toward the door with his chin. "Flies this route often. People really like him." Felissa didn't respond. She didn't trust her voice not to crack. She nodded faintly and turned her gaze back to the window, her reflection faint in the glass, barely visible against the backdrop of sunrise streaking across the sky. The safety demonstration began. The cabin lights dimmed. Flight attendants moved like shadows, performing motions they no longer had to think about, their faces blank and their eyes focused elsewhere. When the attendant passed her row again, she reached across Felissa's tray without warning and took the untouched meal, causing a fork to clatter against the plastic. Her body had become a target, her presence a trigger, and every breath she took now felt like a quiet act of defiance. She stared straight ahead, forcing herself not to look around, forcing her shoulders to stay squared even though every part of her wanted to shrink into invisibility. As she sat motionless, the curtains separating first class from the rest of the plane fluttered open briefly, and a child from economy section darted through, giggling as he chased after a rolling toy that had slipped from his hands. The boy couldn't have been older than 6 or 7, his blonde curls bouncing as he sprinted down the aisle, unbothered by the clear boundary between premium and general seating. He veered toward Felissa's side of the row, and his small foot clipped her ankle. She felt a sharp jolt but instinctively smiled, trying to ease the moment with warmth. The child turned to her, momentarily startled, before quickly darting away. Before she could return her gaze to the window, the boy's father appeared. Tall, sharp-jawed, wearing a Patagonia vest and expensive wireless earbuds. He gave her a quick scan, eyes narrowing when they landed on her face. The brief smile on Felissa's lips faded as she registered the man's expression. No apology, no acknowledgement, just a look, one that carried 1,000 years of contempt, and then a stiff, silent retreat, guiding the boy away with one hand while turning to glare at her as though the contact had been her fault. She exhaled through her nose, slow and controlled, but the heat was rising again in her chest. A few minutes passed before a flight attendant appeared at her side, this time one of the male crew members, younger, clean-cut, and carrying a clipboard. He leaned in slightly, voice pitched low enough to sound conspiratorial. "Ma'am, we ask all passengers to respect personal space boundaries in this cabin," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just want to make sure there are no disturbances or discomfort for others around you." Felissa blinked. Her face stayed neutral, but inside her thoughts churned violently. She hadn't moved. She hadn't spoken. She had been nothing but still, and yet somehow she was the disruption. She considered saying something, asking what rules she had violated or what behavior had been deemed disturbing, but she knew the answer already. Her presence was the offense. She said nothing. The attendant nodded, as if her silence confirmed something unspoken, and walked away. She sat still for another 10 minutes, arms folded, heartbeat climbing, before deciding she needed to stretch her legs. She reached for her tray table, intending to fold it up and rise from her seat, but the latch wouldn't move. She tried again. It remained stuck. She shifted her weight and applied more pressure, trying to jiggle it free, but it was locked in place, the hinges refusing to budge. She looked down and realized the locking mechanism, an internal electronic latch, was engaged, a feature she had rarely seen activated before. Her jaw tensed. This was no accident. She pressed the service button. 10 minutes passed. No one came. She pressed it again. Still nothing. Finally, a different attendant appeared, an older woman this time, with a smile too practiced and a voice that dripped with artificial concern. "Yes, ma'am." "The tray table stuck," Felissa said evenly, tapping the corner. "I can't get it to move." The attendant reached down and tugged lightly, then shrugged. "Looks like a technical glitch," she said. "These models have finicky locking systems. Nothing to worry about." She started to walk away. "Could you release it from the panel?" Felissa asked, still calm, though her voice was beginning to fray at the edges. The attendant paused, pretending to consider it. "Unfortunately, that would require resetting the whole console. Not something we do mid-flight. Should be fine once we land." She turned and walked away without another word. Felissa sat frozen, her tray locked in front of her like a barrier, her legs trapped beneath, unable to stand. She rested her hands on her knees, staring down at the fixed structure as if it symbolized something larger, which, of course, it did. Control, denial, power. She was being immobilized, both literally and metaphorically, boxed into a space she had paid for but was no longer allowed to inhabit freely. It wasn't a glitch. It was a message. As the crew passed again, offering more drinks, she watched as the cart skipped her row entirely, stopping only to pour another round for the man beside her, who had now slipped off his shoes and leaned back with a blanket tucked behind his head. She was beginning to feel the dull ache of not just exclusion, but confinement. The longer she sat, the more apparent it became that nothing about this experience was coincidental. Everything had a pattern. Every small act chipped away at something larger. The tray table, immovable, anchored her to the moment, reminding her with every breath that escape was no longer possible, at least not until touchdown. She had shifted only once in the last half hour, trying to ease the growing ache in her hip, but even that motion had drawn a glance from a nearby passenger, a look not of curiosity, but of contempt. The crew moved through the cabin again, this time carrying small white baskets lined with silk, each one filled with premium headphones, facial refreshers, and neatly folded hot towels wrapped in embroidered linen. The ritual had an elegance to it, the way the attendant placed each item down with care, exchanging nods and smiles as if performing a quiet ceremony. She watched the man in 2B receive his set with a polite thank you, watched the couple behind her receive their towels with delighted nods, watched each passenger's space become a personal sanctuary. Her row came next. The attendant's cart paused. She placed a towel and headphone kit down on the armrest of 2B. She turned slightly. Her hands hovered over Thelissa's seat for a fraction of a second, then moved on. Nothing was placed on her tray. No towel, no kit, no words. The cart rolled forward. Thelissa didn't flinch. Her arms stayed folded, her face blank, but inside something wilted. She could no longer explain this away. It wasn't forgetfulness. It wasn't a missed gesture or accidental oversight. It was intentional. It was deliberate. It was precise. And it was cruel. She looked to her left and caught sight of the passengers in row 3, a group of young professionals, early 30s maybe, wearing coordinated brand merchandise, their voices hushed as they leaned into one another, speaking in tones just low enough to create exclusion and just loud enough to invite curiosity. One of them, a woman with sharp cheekbones and oversized sunglasses, peeked over the top of her seat and stared. Another, a man with slick back hair and a too-perfect smile, followed her gaze and tilted his phone slightly upward. Thelissa registered the move instantly. The lens faced toward her. He angled it as if scrolling through something, but she knew the posture too well. He was recording. The laughter began seconds later, a low ripple passing from one seatmate to another like a whispered joke. It wasn't boisterous. It was worse than that. It was mocking, restrained, designed to draw no attention from crew, but maximum discomfort for the target. Her body stiffened. Her jaw locked. She stared past them, through them, willing herself not to react. She didn't want to give them the satisfaction of acknowledgement, but a flush began creeping up her neck all the same. Her skin prickled. Her scalp tightened. She could feel their eyes dancing across her face, her posture, her stillness, interpreting it not as restraint but submission. She glanced away and caught sight of the reflection in the small dark screen embedded in the seat in front of her. Her own image looked back, distorted and grainy, a woman trapped behind glass. But in the background, faint but clear, she could see the raised arm of the man in row 3 holding his phone ever so slightly toward her space, still pretending he wasn't. She turned back to the window. Outside, the sky was beginning to darken as the plane soared toward its destination. The cloud cover below stretched endlessly, pale gray and empty. She wanted to be anywhere but here. She wanted to fold into herself and disappear completely, but she also knew that disappearing was what they wanted. Every ignored gesture, every denied request, every missing amenity, every stare and chuckle and sideways glance was meant to fracture her. Death by 1,000 exclusions. She closed her eyes and counted backward from 20, not to calm herself, but to keep from crying. She couldn't let it spill out here, not in this cabin, not while they watched. She opened her eyes when the flight attendant passed by again with the next cart, this time filled with dessert options. Tiny cheesecakes, chocolate mousse, panna cotta in little glass jars with gold spoons. The attendant asked the man next to her which dessert he preferred. He took two. Felissa kept her eyes fixed on the tray, not expecting to be addressed, not bothering to raise her hand. The cart passed without pause. She didn't even get a glance. The laughter behind her hadn't stopped. They were quieter now, but no less cruel. She knew they were still watching. She could feel it in the way the air shifted around her. Her back ached from staying upright too long. Her thighs were starting to cramp. Her left foot had gone numb. Still, she remained still. She wouldn't give them the movement they seemed to crave, some twitch or reaction to validate their amusement. They were looking for discomfort, and she refused to give them visible satisfaction. But that didn't stop the burn. It didn't stop the gnawing pain growing in her stomach. She had dealt with corporate microaggressions. She had endured boardroom condescension. But this was something else. A sharp pressure began pulsing in her bladder, subtle at first, but gradually escalating into a demand her body could no longer ignore. She held out as long as she could, refusing to give the cabin another reason to follow her movement, but the pain became too much to suppress. With quiet resolve, she exhaled through her nose, pressed her hands against the edge of the locked tray, and slowly twisted sideways beneath it, contorting her frame until she could ease one leg out from the narrow space. Her body protested, sore from the confinement, but she finally stood upright and steadied herself in the aisle. She didn't make eye contact with the other passengers. She didn't acknowledge the phone that had quickly disappeared beneath the tray table behind her. She just walked forward, slow and deliberate, toward the lavatory near the galley at the front of the first-class cabin. She passed two flight attendants chatting beside a beverage cart parked in front of the curtain. As she stepped to the left to squeeze past, one of them reached for the cart handle, then abruptly pushed it forward. The metal corner struck her shin with a heavy thud, the edge of the tray slamming into bone. Pain shot through her leg, immediate and searing, and she stumbled, barely catching herself against the armrest of a nearby seat. Her breath escaped in a hiss, and her free hand clenched involuntarily. The attendants looked up as if surprised, though their faces betrayed nothing but forced neutrality. One of them leaned in slightly, lips curled into a half-smile, and murmured something to the other. The second attendant laughed, not loudly, but clearly enough for Felissa to hear. The kind of laugh that wasn't about amusement, but assertion, as if her pain was not only predictable, but deserved. Felissa didn't respond. She didn't speak. She didn't even glance at them again. Instead, she pushed forward toward the lavatory, her leg throbbing with each step, her jaw clenched so tight it hurt. She closed the small door behind her and pressed her back against it, bracing herself in the tiny space, breathing in short, rapid bursts. Her hands trembled. She could see the faint redness already blooming just below her knee where the cart had struck. She stared at it for several seconds, unable to move. She didn't cry, though the sting in her eyes threatened to spill. She just stood there, frozen, a low hum vibrating in her ears. The flight was not a trip anymore. It was a siege. After several long moments, she composed herself. She ran cold water over her wrists, dabbed at the sweat on her forehead, and adjusted her jacket. She didn't want to walk back, but she had no choice. The cabin was a battlefield now, and she had no cover. She unlocked the door and stepped into the aisle again. As she passed the attendants, one of them offered a tight-lipped smirk and quickly turned away. No apology, no concern, no trace of humanity. When she finally reached her seat, she paused. Her carry-on bag, which had been zipped and tucked neatly under the seat when she left, was now slightly ajar. The zipper had been pulled 3/4 open, and the front pouch flapped downward. Something inside had been disturbed. She crouched carefully, ignoring the ache in her leg, and placed a hand inside the bag. Her tablet had been moved from the inner sleeve to the main compartment. Her compact wallet sat askew, no longer pressed into the side pouch. Even her travel-sized toiletry bag had been unzipped and left partially open. Her breath caught. Someone had gone through her belongings. Her eyes flicked upward toward the man beside her, still immersed in his movie, and then down the aisle, where no one seemed to be paying attention. A cold sweat broke out across her back. She looked toward the galley, where the same two attendants were now resetting trays and whispering to each other again, glancing up occasionally in her direction. She pressed the call button above her seat. To her surprise, one of the attendants came almost immediately, one of the two who had been by the cart. He approached with that same mask of manufactured politeness, as if customer service was still in operation for her. "Yes," he asked. "My bag," she said, voice low and controlled. "It's been unzipped. My things have been moved." The attendant nodded without hesitation, without even looking at the bag. "We received a report about an untagged item under the seat," he said. "Sometimes passengers mix up their luggage. Security protocol required us to inspect it briefly." "It was my bag," she said. "It's been here since I boarded." "As I said," he replied, already shifting his weight to leave. "It was flagged as a misplaced item. Nothing was removed. All resolved." "Who flagged it?" she asked. He didn't answer. He gave her a thin, unbothered smile and stepped away before she could speak again. Every moment of this flight had evolved from discomfort to hostility to full-fledged assault, and yet the quietness of it, the procedural tone of cruelty, the sterile way it had been executed, made it all the more unbearable. She knew if she spoke up now, if she demanded accountability, they would dismiss it all as misunderstanding, miscommunication, protocol. That was always the game. Inflict injury in layers, so thin no one wound bled loud enough to be heard. But now something inside her, something long buried under years of composure and calculation, began to shift. She had endured enough. She no longer had to accept invisibility as a requirement for her safety. Her face remained neutral, her breathing controlled, but her mind sharpened. She scanned the cabin and spotted the senior flight purser near the rear of the first-class galley, a man perhaps in his early 50s, with silver hair, sharp posture, and a voice she remembered from earlier announcements. He wasn't part of the earlier incidents. Not yet. She waited until the aisle cleared momentarily, then stood, slow and careful, the pain in her leg flaring as she rose. She didn't limp. She wouldn't give them that. She walked quietly toward the rear, her steps measured. As she neared the purser, she opened her mouth to speak, but before word could form, another attendant, one she hadn't even seen earlier, swept between them like a curtain, intercepting her with a tight smile. "Ma'am, please return to your seat. We're preparing for light turbulence ahead," she said, her tone firm with a practiced authority that left no room for dialogue. "I need to speak with," Thalissa began, her voice steady. "It's not the time, ma'am," the attendant interrupted, already guiding her backward with a hand not quite touching, but pushing just the same. "Seatbelt signs will be on shortly. Please cooperate." She was forced back to her row without a chance to respond, every step back toward a seething with frustration. She sat down again, face stone still, eyes focused on nothing. The belt clicked into place with a weight heavier than before. It wasn't just restraint, it was silencing. The lights above flickered briefly, and a soft chime rang out as the captain's voice returned, warning of potential light turbulence ahead and requesting passengers to remain seated. The cabin dimmed, and the curtain behind first class was drawn shut again, sealing her into this world of quiet cruelty. Her hands dropped to her lap, where her bag now rested, slightly open at the top. She reached to close it when a sudden jolt shook the aircraft. Not violent, just enough to tip a tray, to rattle glasses in the galley, to dislodge a single item from the partially unzipped carry-on. A small plastic card slipped from the side pouch, fluttered downward, and landed face up in the aisle with a soft click. She didn't notice immediately. Her hand froze inches from a zipper. But someone else did. The purser, returning from a galley, stepped into the aisle as the plane steadied and paused. His eyes scanned the floor, then locked onto the badge. He leaned down, picked it up, and read the front. His fingers tightened slightly around it. He looked at the photo, then at the name beneath it, then back at the woman seated in 2A. The name printed in bold letters beneath the photo read, Dr. Thalissa Rowe, Executive Vice President, Corporate Ethics Division. amorous aeronautics. His breath caught. He didn't blink. His eyes lifted slowly and locked with hers. For the first time on this flight, someone looked at her and truly saw her. Not the imagined stereotype these crew members had built, not the silent passenger to be toyed with, but the actual woman, the authority behind one of the largest private sector aviation regulatory bodies in the country, a watchdog organization with the power to make or break airline compliance ratings. His lips parted slightly as if to speak, but no words came out. He was still holding her badge. She sat still, her eyes steady on his. She didn't flinch, didn't smile, didn't ask for it back. She let the weight of the moment hang between them like the final note in a long, bitter symphony. The purser's face shifted, color draining from his cheeks, as realization crashed in waves behind his eyes. He turned toward the attendant who had intercepted her earlier, then toward the two who had been by the cart. Everything about his demeanor changed. Whispers stirred among the flight attendants nearby as the tension around him grew palpable. Thalissa remained seated, calm and poised, but inside she felt the weight of eyes turning in her direction, some wary, others curious, and a few already retreating behind professional masks of neutrality. Minutes passed, the low hum of the engines the only sound, as crew members quietly gathered in the back near the service area. The purser was at the center of a rapid conversation, gesturing sharply, speaking in clipped tones that were too low for passengers to hear, but loud enough to charge the atmosphere. The flight attendants who had earlier ignored, mocked, and violated Thalissa were pulled aside one by one, their faces folding into sudden expressions of concern and compliance as they were informed of the situation. The woman who had yanked the seatbelt tight, the ones who had skipped her during service, even the attendant who pushed the cart into her leg, all vanished from the cabin without explanation. Within 15 minutes, a fresh crew of attendants in crisp new uniforms and eager, apologetic expressions replaced them seamlessly. The transformation was surgical, precise, and unspoken, but it spoke volumes. The cabin hummed with a new energy, one of tentative respect tinged with cautious hope. Thalissa unzipped her bag slowly and extracted a slim folder, its black leather cover embossed with the Skycore Airlines logo. She placed it gently on the fold-down table in front of her, the weight of the moment settling around it like gravity. The gold embossed title caught the light: Skycore Executive Review Internal Compliance Audit. Beneath it, in elegant script, was a handwritten note: approved by T. Rowe, Vice Chair, Board of Directors. She allowed herself a brief, almost imperceptible breath of relief. This folder represented more than corporate oversight. It symbolized accountability, transparency, and power. The very things the cabin crew had been denying her presence and dignity to suppress. Around her, passengers shifted in their seats, sensing the change. The man beside her cleared his throat, eyes wide, unsure how to navigate the sudden tension. The younger woman across the aisle glanced at the folder and then back at Thalissa with newfound respect, nodding slightly. The subtle social hierarchy that had oppressed her was being rewritten in real time. The new attendants approached her row with smiles that carried warmth, genuine and unforced. One placed a chilled bottle of water on her tray, then offered a soft, "Can I get you anything else, ma'am?" The tone was different, careful, attentive, deferential. The words were small, but the message was unmistakable. She was no longer invisible. Thalissa allowed herself to lean back in her seat and close her eyes briefly. She could feel the tight knot of tension in her chest unravel just a little. She hadn't needed to raise her voice or demand justice. The truth in that folder had spoken louder than any protest could. But she knew this moment was fragile. The flight was far from over, and the forces that had sought to diminish her might still lurk beneath the surface. Still, for the first time, she felt seen, acknowledged, respected in the way she deserved. The purser returned after a few moments and approached quietly. His demeanor had changed completely, no longer a man tasked with damage control, but an emissary of respect. "Dr. Rowe," he said carefully, "we apologize for the earlier treatment. It was unacceptable and not in line with Skycore's values." She nodded once, acknowledging the apology without words. The conversation between them was brief but significant, a tacit agreement that the rest of the flight would be handled with dignity and professionalism. Felissa's thoughts drifted briefly to the upcoming meetings she would oversee once the plane landed. The audits, the investigations, the reforms that her division had spearheaded to root out systemic issues like those she had just endured firsthand. She wondered how many flights this crew had been on where similar abuses occurred unnoticed, unchecked, and unpunished. She resolved silently that the change would not stop here. Her presence on this plane was not an accident. It was a test, and she was ready to make sure it was the last. The cabin settled into a quieter rhythm. Passengers resumed their reading and screen time, but a new energy lingered, one of respect undercurrents, unspoken acknowledgement of what had just transpired. Felissa remained seated, composed but alert, eyes scanning the cabin as the flight attendants began their descent down the aisles to collect items and assist with luggage. Near the cockpit door, which remained closed during the flight, a sudden flurry of activity caught her attention. 3 individuals in crisp uniforms entered the cabin, security personnel from the airport authority, distinguished by badges and radios clipped to their belts. Their expressions were serious, their movements purposeful. Whispers rippled through the first-class section as the group approached the cockpit, their presence commanding immediate respect and curiosity. The door opened, and out stepped Captain Harris, the man who had wielded quiet cruelty with such confidence earlier in the flight. His expression was unreadable, a mixture of shock, defiance, and defeat. The security officers flanked him silently, one of them speaking briefly and firmly into a handheld radio before addressing Harris. "Sir, you are relieved of command effective immediately. You are to accompany us for further investigation." The pilot's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, a slow nod his only concession. The passengers watched as he followed the officers down the aisle, the flight attendants parting respectfully to make way. A ripple of murmured approval passed through the cabin. The woman seated beside Felissa whispered to her companion, "Finally, about time someone took action." The announcement came moments later over the public address system. The calm voice of a new captain echoed through the cabin, confirming the change in command and assuring passengers of a safe and uneventful continuation to their destination. But the real surprise came next. The flight attendant's voice filled the cabin, crisp and deliberate. "Attention all passengers. We request the following crew members report immediately to legal affairs upon disembarkation: Rachel Miller, lead flight attendant; Amanda Graves, Jason Cole, and Melissa Tran." The names rang through the cabin like a roll call of accountability, each one met with a mix of gasps, nods, and stunned silence. Felissa felt a slow, satisfying swell of vindication rise inside her. The very people who had subjected her to systematic mistreatment were now being called to answer for their actions. Her phone vibrated softly against the armrest. Without looking, she saw a string of messages from colleagues and legal teams confirming that the airline's internal ethics division had been alerted immediately upon her flight's departure. The wheels of justice had been set in motion long before the plane had even landed. As passengers gathered their belongings and began to rise, the atmosphere was charged with a new energy. Conversations sparked around Felissa, discreet nods and whispered commendations acknowledging her quiet strength. The man beside her, once indifferent, now offered a tentative smile. "You handled that well," he said softly. She returned the smile briefly, appreciating the small but meaningful gesture. As the cabin emptied, the new crew moved with an air of professionalism and respect. The replacement flight attendants approached Felissa to apologize once more and offer assistance with her carry-on. She accepted with quiet dignity, grateful for the acknowledgement but knowing the real battle had only just begun. Walking down the jet bridge, she caught sight of the security officers escorting Captain Harris toward a waiting vehicle. His head was lowered, shoulders heavy with the weight of his actions and consequences. A small group of airline executives waited nearby, their faces grave but resolute, ready to begin the process of healing the reputation damaged by the flight's events. Felissa's phone rang suddenly. She answered without hesitation, her voice calm but firm. The conversation was brief, a confirmation of meetings scheduled to review and overhaul the airline's training protocols, new policies to prevent discrimination, and plans for a public statement acknowledging the incident and pledging reform. She ended the call and looked up at the clear blue sky, feeling a quiet sense of purpose settle over her. The morning sun poured through the vast glass windows of the airport lounge, illuminating a scene that felt worlds away from the turmoil Felissa Rowe had endured just hours before. Passengers milled about, some seated with coffee in hand, others rushing to gates, the bustle of travel flowing like a river around them. Yet, amid the normalcy, one thing stood out, a large, prominently displayed poster mounted near the entrance, commanding attention not by volume but by gravity. Bold black letters spelled out a message that rippled through the crowd. SkyCorps Airlines. Zero tolerance for discrimination. Mandatory retraining in effect. We apologize publicly to Vice Chair Rowe for this unacceptable incident. The words were unambiguous, carrying the weight of accountability and promise. People paused to read, some nodding solemnly, others whispering to companions. Nearby, a digital screen showcased a rotating banner of flight information and advertisements. But beneath the flicker of commercial messages, a scrolling line of text made clear an extraordinary announcement: Felissa Rowe Special Passenger. From now on, her flights will be personally overseen by Executive Protection Protocol. It was not just a statement of security. It was a recognition of status, a formal acknowledgement that the woman who had been wronged was not only protected but honored. Felissa sat quietly on a leather bench, her fingers resting on the folder from the flight, her posture relaxed, but her eyes sharp and alert. She wasn't a woman who sought sympathy or spectacle, but she understood the power of visibility, of naming injustice openly. This public display was a necessary step, a ripple that could grow into a wave. Around her, fellow travelers glanced in her direction, some offering small smiles or respectful nods. A few approached, extending hands and words of encouragement, gestures that, though small, reaffirmed her strength and resilience. She accepted them with grace, knowing that no single act could undo the weight of a lifetime struggle, but that every acknowledgement mattered. As she rose to move toward the departure gates, her phone buzzed softly. She checked the screen to see messages confirming scheduled meetings with airline executives, diversity and inclusion officers, and civil rights advocates. Plans were already underway for comprehensive policy changes, staff training programs, and a new culture of accountability that would, she hoped, prevent another passenger from enduring what she had. Her thoughts drifted briefly to the many faces she had seen on the flight, the indifferent, the cruel, the apologetic, and the redeemed. Each played a part in a story that was bigger than any one person. It was a story about power and prejudice, about silence and speech, about systems and individuals. She had been a victim, yes, but also a catalyst. The terminal's announcement system crackled softly, calling passengers to board. She took a deep breath and stepped forward, her stride steady and assured. The journey was not just a flight anymore. It was a mission. To transform pain into progress, to hold the sky to higher standards, to remind everyone, whether in the cabin of a plane or the corridors of power, that dignity is not negotiable and justice is not optional. Outside, the runway stretched toward the horizon, a symbol of movement and possibility. Felissa glanced upward, feeling the cool breeze of change brush across her skin. This was more than an ending. It was a beginning. The story she had lived through, marked by hardship and resilience, would become a beacon, a testament to the power of standing firm, speaking truth, and demanding respect. As she disappeared into the crowd, one thought stayed with her. No matter how high the flight, no matter how long the journey, justice must always find its way to the skies. The end. If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe to stay updated on more powerful, real-life inspired narratives. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What part of the plot resonated most with you? Where are you watching from? Share your reactions and your location in the comments below. Your feedback helps us create stories that truly connect.